On tonight's roundtable, Maura Carlin will lead a discussion on youth homelessness in the community with the Westchester Children's Association and Westhab.
And welcome to the Local Live Roundtable. We're discussing homeless children and youth. Perhaps surprising to many, this is an issue that impacts the Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Rye Neck community. As you can see from this map, there are children here without homes. Now you can join our conversation, ask your questions, share experiences. The contact information is on your screen. Our guests are Jordana Lorenzo, the Program and Policy Manager for Westchester Children's Association, and Elissa Ramos, the Assistant Vice President for Housing Programs at Westhab. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Jordana, the Westchester Children's Alliance studied this issue and recently released a report, which was the source of the map that I hope was put up. Let's start with what you consider homelessness. It's more than people living on the streets, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when we're talking about homelessness impacting school-age children, especially in Westchester County, it's a very different picture than what we normally think of when we're talking about homelessness, right? Too often when we're talking about homelessness, we think of people who are literally living on the street, or maybe living in a car, or maybe living under a bridge. But honestly, homelessness is so much more than that. And I know Elissa can speak more about it, but it could be your next door neighbor experiencing homelessness. It could be your child's best friend. Homelessness is also talking about stable housing. And that's when we get into more of what it looks like for children in Westchester County.
So what do you mean by stable or unstable housing?
So stable housing, there's a lot of housing insecurity. People don't realize that a lot of people experience that. And I want to sort of also go back to her point. Often when we think about homeless people, we're thinking about people that are sleeping in the street under the car. And that's not necessarily true. If we think, for example, we're talking about children and youth, but also even college students, which are young adults. Mm-hmm. There was a research study done by Temple University and Wisconsin Hope Lab, and they surveyed about 43,000 students in 66 colleges, for example. They found that 36% of all the college students had housing insecurity. 46% of the college students that were attending community college also experienced housing insecurity. And what it means is that you don't know if next month you're going to be living there. Right. And it could be because of a loss of income. It could be for many, many, many reasons. Mm-hmm. You could have a family where one parent, unfortunately, they lose that parent and that income is lost. So now they have to think about how I'm going to pay the rent the next day, or the next month, actually.
Is the housing insecurity or the homelessness always due to economic reasons?
That's a good point. I think in to a large degree it is. Because people need the money to pay for their rent. Right. But also people need money for food. Sometimes people have to choose, do I eat or do I pay the rent? Right. That in itself creates not only housing insecurity, but it also creates food insecurity as well, which a lot of our families experience that.
Yes. What's been the trend in Westchester on homelessness for
actually,
students?
And that's a great question, because over the past 4 years, it's been increasing steadily. Right now in Westchester County as a whole, so we know for the Rye Neck Mamaroneck School District, there's over 60 kids experiencing homelessness here. But if you look at the county as a whole, right now over 2,700 children are experiencing homelessness. That's huge. And if we're looking at it from that bigger picture of not only unsheltered, but sheltered situations, as Elissa was saying, it's an economic issue, but we're also talking about affordable housing. That's a huge issue here in Westchester. And if we're bringing it back to Mamaroneck, trying to find affordable housing for some families is such a challenge. And we're talking about overcrowded homes. We're talking about families who are bouncing from home to home because they can't find a permanent house themselves.
So is there a demographic component, white, black, Hispanic, or citizenship versus an immigration status, or LGBTQ? What's the demographic?
Mm-hmm. I think I would say it varies. The other piece to this is with homelessness and how it is defined, is that, for example, for young adults and the youth, they don't normally go to shelters. So how is that being captured when we collecting data? Because they tend to couch surf. They tend to, this week I stay with this friend, This other week, I stayed with another friend. For intents and purposes, they are homeless. But, and I know you're going to go, Jordana will go into this, you have the HUD definition, the educational system definition, which is very different. And that's the key to this. How do we define that? Because it's being defined differently in different systems.
Well, let's ask how you calculated, how you did it for the calculation of the numbers that we discussed.
And just as Elissa was saying, right, there's different definitions that exist right now for homelessness. There's actually over 4 right now. So there's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. When they talk about homelessness, they're talking about those who are in emergency shelters or those who are living on the streets. Now, their numbers are very small because you're only capturing just a tiny fraction of those experiencing homelessness. Now, the other number that I was talking about, that 2,700 number, that's actually being captured by school districts. So every school district, including Mamaroneck School District, has what is called a homeless liaison. They are the ones who are talking to parents and talking to students and getting a better understanding of their situation and actually writing down whether or not they're experiencing homelessness. Now we know, and it's said in the report that we're going to be talking a little bit more about, that that number only captures half of what actually exists.
So
it's
you think
still
the
an
number is
undercount.
actually twice as large?
Yes.
And what's the basis for believing that?
As Elissa was saying, people usually don't come forward in talking about their experience, or they may not even know that they're experiencing homelessness. When we're talking about couch surfing, and we're, let's say, a 16-year-old, they're like, oh, you know, I'm just staying with my friend for a little while. In their head, that's not homelessness. And there's a huge stigma around the word homelessness. So when we're talking about defining what that experience means, we also need to change the narrative around what the homeless experience looks like.
Do you think it's an intentionally hidden problem in communities in Westchester?
That's a good point. I just think to a certain degree, it's not a conversation that happens in the open. You know, people don't feel comfortable sharing they are homeless.
Right.
It's not something they walk around telling. I mean, for kids in school, that brings about a lot of stigma. For the adult in the family, just as well. But you know, at the end of the day, they need to be counted, because going back, we talk about couch surfing for the young people, but we have families that have to double up. Perfect example of that at times, you know, when we think about homelessness. There was a youth that was interviewed for this report that was in one of our programs, because we ended up providing housing for this particular young man. And his homeless situation was as a result of the death of his grandmother, and the family had to split. Each individual had to go and live with somebody else. But again, he was couch surfing with friends. For intents and purposes, he was homeless. We were able to connect him to services, obviously, and he was referred to us for our program, and he was able to obtain an apartment and all of that, and it's been a successful story. So, you know, to a certain degree, I think that we need to think about in the context of how stigmatizing that can be, and how do we create more of an openness about the discussion so that people feel more comfortable sharing.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break.
Sure.
We'll be back and continue this discussion, so stay with us.
I went through years of guilt, thinking that I must have done something to deserve that.
I knew if I told someone, they would say it's my fault.
I thought I was going to die without ever having spoken about the abuse that happened to me.
When you've been sexually abused as a child, it can take years or even decades to process what happened.
That's why we changed the law and passed the Child Victims Act.
The Child Victims Act means that survivors have more time to bring our abusers
And the institutions that may have protected them.
To justice in the courts.
I was in my 40s before I could even tell someone what happened, let alone think about going to the police or to a lawyer. When I finally did, it was too late because of New York's strict statute of limitations.
Survivors can now file a criminal claim up to age 28 years old.
And up to age 55 years old for a civil claim.
And starting on August 14th,
for only 1 year.
Survivors who were previously told that we were too old or that it was too late to file a civil lawsuit
Will now be able to do exactly that.
No matter how long ago the abuse happened.
anyone can do it.
anyone.
Anyone.
Every survivor has the right to pursue justice in the courts.
If that's what's right for you.
Find out more about the Child Victims Act by going to safehorizon.org.
Even if it's just to talk to someone, because that's what I did.
But remember, whatever you decide to do,
It's up to you.
And you're not alone.
Because now,
it's our choice.
It's our choice. It's our choice.
Welcome back. We're discussing homeless youth, particularly in the Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Rye Neck area. Of course, you can join our conversation, send in your questions, phone in, give a comment. We'd love to hear from you. So looking at the map from the report, we see that, as we discussed, that there are an estimated 62 homeless students in the Mamaroneck and Rye Neck area. And based on what you said, you think that's at least double. So Elissa, Westhab is responsible for shelters, and there are no shelters in Larchmont, Mamaroneck, and Rye Neck. So one of the questions that someone asked was, how are there homeless here then?
Okay. I mean, you have a lot of areas where shelters don't exist, but there will be a shelter that will cover a particular area. So for example, in Westchester, the homeless families, particularly I refer to the Coachman in White Plains, the Coachman Family Center. Or if you're in Mount Vernon, you could go to the Vernon Plaza, which are two of the shelters that Westhab manages. So, but also, if for the people that are homeless here, for all we know, they're in transitional housing, which is another piece to this.
And that's different than a shelter.
And that is a little bit different because, for example, as I mentioned, the Coachman Family Center and Vernon Plaza are emergency shelters. But for example, we have emergency housing apartments, which means that a lot of families transition from the emergency shelter into transition housing, which typically apartments that are scattered site in the community. So you could very well be living next to a person that is still considered homeless because for all intents and purposes, that's not their permanent home.
Right.
So there's that transition that happens for a lot of families that we work with. And then ultimately we work with them to achieve, moving into permanent housing, which becomes a home, home of their own or their apartment. So we cannot assume that because there's not a shelter here, particularly in this area, that there are no homeless.
And I want to add to what you're saying about permanent housing, right? And I think it's discussed a lot in our report. If you don't have a permanent address, that is considered homeless, right? It's not a permanent place. It's not stable housing. So that's what we try to say. For children and youth, they deserve stable and adequate living situations. So when they're in flux, really they are experiencing a layer of homelessness. And homelessness is not a one-size-fits-all. It looks very different. There are very different interpretations of what that looks like.
So if you don't have an address and you want to go to school, because this is based on students, and in order to register with a school district, you need to have a residence in the district or you're not entitled to school in that district. How are you district eligible if you don't have a home in the district?
That's a great question. So what's interesting about Westchester County, and we know we have over 40 municipalities, over 40 school districts. From my understanding and based on what we gathered from our initial investigation, if a student had an address upon registration, and let's say a week later they're homeless, and they're living in a different district. By law, they can still attend their original district upon registration. And the county will accommodate, or the original school district will accommodate for transportation of that student from one district to another. So really you can put down any address. If you are already in that district, that entitles you to stay in the district if you are experiencing homelessness.
Okay. We actually have a question, I think from a caller. Caller, are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead,
yes,
please.
I am. First, I want to thank you for shining some light on this topic. I used to be a teacher. I'm a retired teacher. And if I had a homeless youth in my classroom, would I be told about that? Or are the privacy laws such that that information would not be shared with me?
Thank you, caller.
That's a great question. And from my understanding, yes, that would be shared. But again, I think the real issue is a lot of students either don't come forward or it's not being captured. So the school district would have awareness that a child is experiencing homelessness if the homeless liaison of that school district is capturing that student.
But that's different than a teacher knowing.
Right.
And
But
as
they
a
would be notified, yes.
They would be notified.
Correct.
So I was going to ask the impact on the teacher, but let's go to what is the impact on a student who doesn't have a home?
Oh, well, there's a lot of long-term implications related to that. And one statistic always sticks out in my head for me. If a student is experiencing homelessness, they are 87% more likely to drop out. That in itself, just think, you drop out of school, the likelihood of getting a job, and all of the things that come along with that into adulthood. And that's just one piece, and that's just talking about school. The mental health implications, the physical health implications, and I'm sure Elissa can speak a little bit more about, what is happening in
Absolutely.
her programs.
There's impact, health, mental health, there's emotional impact. And you're correct in what you mentioned in terms of the percentage that would drop out. Sometimes it leads to kids getting left back, so they fall behind.
Behavior issues,
Behavioral
perhaps?
issues, absolutely. There's a lot of anxiety and stress that is caused by being homeless and having, housing insecurity. So there's a lot of components to that. And going back, I just want to kind of chime in on the previous question you asked about how children will get to school. For example, in the shelters that we have, every morning there are buses parked in the front, and they go in different directions of the county because they're going to take that child to the school district
that they lived in before.
And part of the reason, and it's really important to do that, because part of the reason that is done is because we know that the shelter situation is not where they're going to remain. So the hope is that if they go back into their community, at least their schooling is not disruptive.
Okay.
They don't end up 4 months in one school and 3 months in another.
Okay. We're going to take another quick
Sure.
break. Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages.
LMC TV Media Center is the spot for your next party. Lights, camera, liftoff. The possibilities are endless. Space adventures, video gaming, whatever they imagine, LMC can achieve. Kids of all ages have fun making their own videos in our professional TV studio. LMC TV is the perfect spot for your creative kid to celebrate with friends and make a memory that will last forever in video. Party themes can range depending on their desire. Fun news shows, music videos, stop motion, overall silliness, our cameras can capture it all. Contact us to book a party today.
What do you do for a living?
I'm an engineer at IBM. I work within our Watson Internet of Things division, and I'm also an inventor.
Wow, that's really cool.
The fun part for me of inventing is just learning new technologies, creating ideas and problems.
Welcome back. We're discussing homeless youth in the community. And we just got a viewer question emailed in. So what can someone do to help if they suspect someone they know may be dealing with homelessness?
Okay.
Either or both.
I know. Sure. So I first want to talk about our website, westhab.org. You can go there to our website, and there's a lot of information there for people who may want to help someone who's experiencing homelessness. They can also call us. Our number is 914-345-2800. And we could get a lot of different information because Westhab runs many different programs that a family can definitely benefit. Not just homelessness, but we look at this as with a holistic approach. So, it's not just tackling the homelessness, but if a parent or, the adult in the family needs to be connected to a job training, resume writing, employment services, we have that at Westhab. If they don't know where their kid is going to go after school, in our shelters, we have after-school programs and activities for the children.
Are there people in shelters who have jobs?
Absolutely. That's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yes.
Because a lot of people think that, the people in the shelter, they may just be sitting in the shelter, but in all actuality, a lot of the people that are in our shelters go to work, whether it's part-time work or full-time work, or they could be in between jobs, but a lot of people go to work.
And I think that stems back to affordable housing here in Westchester County. I mean, let's think about it, minimum wage. Does that actually get you to be able to afford rent here in the county? And it's really a hand-in-hand conversation. And when we started this report, it kept coming up for us about looking into affordable housing here in the county and having more of it, because that's really the issue. So many people who are experiencing homelessness do have jobs. So how can we connect them to a stable home?
Going back to the homelessness situation, though, do you have any recommendations?
Yes, plenty. And I
Okay.
think for us, our lens is always children and youth at Westchester
Right.
Children's Association. And I do want to go back to that question that was asked before of what can you do? I think if we start with changing our mindset of what the homeless experience is, especially here in this county, again, it's not always just the people you see living on the streets. It could be your child's best friend. It could be your neighbor. You never know. If we can start with changing our mindset, I think we can move forward with more positive solutions. And also for us, bringing those to the table who are living with homelessness, who are impacted, working with our partners to better understand how we can do better in the system. We know that there's great resources out there, but not all of these kids have access to it. So how can we bridge those gaps? And that's really what we're trying to do with this report. It starts a conversation so that we can figure out how can we move forward and improve outcomes for children and families.
Who reads the report? Where does it go?
So interestingly enough, the report has been available online for the past month, but really we're trying to be strategic about how we distribute and who we deliver it to. So we are doing a mass mailing to superintendents, to homeless liaisons, guidance counselors, elected officials, our community partners. Again, to start that conversation and say, hey, this is what we found. How can we make changes in your district or your community? How is your school district tackling the issue? And we started those conversations in our investigation already, but the culmination of this report really puts it in your face. And it's hard to have those conversations sometimes. And to see those numbers, it can be scary, but at least we're trying to move the needle forward. That's really the goal.
So along the lines of hard conversations, what, if any, conversation should you have if you suspect someone you know is in a situation of homelessness as you've defined it?
I think it's important, and the good thing about this report, it shines the light on an issue that, like you said, people have their own perception of what it should look like, right? So part of it, it's also getting rid of that stigma so that people feel more comfortable sharing with their next door neighbor who may they have a relationship with, but they don't feel comfortable talking about it because they don't want to be stigmatized.
Right.
And just to add to what you said, there are resources, there's just not enough of it. We all know there's not enough resources. Westhab happens to be, we developed and we manage affordable housing. There's not enough of it. Our waiting list for affordable housing sometimes goes up to a year or more. So we know that there is not enough of it. And that's something that if people can support funding for more affordable housing, that will make a difference.
Absolutely.
I just got a question. To what extent, if any, does immigration play a role? In other words, do the homeless kids tend to be newly in the United States or children of undocumented parents? Is that a higher percentage?
And that's a good question. And in this report, that's not covered yet. Again, when we approached this report, we looked at it from a very macro level to try to get an idea of the landscape broadly. But that is definitely something I'm sure that we're going to look into along the way. And again, this is just the start of it. As we continue the investigation and really see where this goes, we're going to have more detailed data. And that's really what we're asking for, too, is more data to get a better picture in landscape.
But
it
is difficult for, for undocumented because there's a lot of services and entitlement benefits that they do not qualify for.
Right.
If their children were born here, there's certainly certain entitlement benefits that they can get through their children because their children being citizens, they will be eligible to receive those benefits. So typically those are the families that we at Westhab struggle with the most in terms of finding housing for them because that is a huge barrier to
is
overcome.
Affordable housing.
Absolutely.
Right.
We're going to have to end there. I want to give you both the opportunity to give out your contact information for your organizations. Go ahead, Jordana.
Yes, you can contact me at wcaforkids.org or by my email, which is jlorenzo, that's my first initial last name, at wca4kids.org.
And you, Elissa, you can give it again.
You could contact us as Westhab, and let me spell that so we don't get it incorrectly. It's westhab.org. I can also be contacted via my email Elissa, ELISSA, .Ramos, RAMOS, @westhab.org.
Thank you both so much for joining us. And
You're
thank
welcome.
you for watching and for participating. Stay tuned. We got more of the Local Live coming right up.